Welcome to the Rational Egoist. Today, we're going to talk about immigration and why it's a good thing. And with us to do that is the executive editor at the Libertarian Institute, the former vice president and editor at the Future of Freedom Foundation, and for 15 years was editor of The Freeman, a publication put out by the Foundation for Economic Education. He is also author of numerous books and articles, including Tethered Citizen: Time to Repeal the Welfare State. Sheldon Richman, welcome back. It's an absolute honor to
Thanks.
have you back on the show.
I was going to say, short time no see. It wasn't that long ago that I was with you.
Okay, so first, what is your position on immigration? I'm pretty sure it's about what mine is, but I just want to get it clear out there.
Well, as an advocate of individual liberty, and that's when it comes to politics, that's where I begin. I'm a liberty fundamentalist. I'll take that. I'll take that title if somebody wants to hurl that at me. I think people, as a general matter, should be able to go where they want and seeking better lives. And, as long as they're not committing aggression. That's where a lot of the arguments is going to be, what constitutes aggression. But if they're not trampling on people's property or their bodies or, their goods, and they're just engaging in voluntary exchange, which can include employment, rent, buying a house, buying stuff at the store. That's fine. That's fine. And so it's good for them and it's good for us in all kinds of ways, which I'm sure we're going to explore. But I'm pro movement around, freedom to move.
It seems like
the Foundation for Economic Education put out a pamphlet many years ago in the 50s called The Freedom to Move.
Oh, I haven't seen that. And I thought
it was somewhat controversial. It should be online because I think I'm responsible for putting it online.
I'm going to check that out. I'm generally for open borders. I concede, if the guys, if somebody's coming over the border, that's a legitimate threat to the country, if they're a terrorist or a criminal. My only problem with saying that is this. If they have a criminal record, then in order to do that, we have to rely on the very governments that they're fleeing for the evidence that they're criminals, which oftentimes are very corrupt regimes who keep very poor records. We don't know the context in which the person's a criminal. So I'm very hesitant. And even with the case where we say somebody's a terrorist or a suspected terrorist, where I would say, okay, we can keep them out, that is dependent on our government having the proper intelligence to do that. And I don't trust them to do that. So I'm a little conflicted when it comes to cases like that. But generally speaking, I think that the moral argument is in the favor of open borders, and I think the economic argument is in favor of open borders. So what if you were to give an elevator pitch moral argument for open borders, what would you say to somebody?
Well, basically what I've already said. I mean, people should be able to do what they want as long as it's not committing aggressive force, initiating force, all those languages, all that language, coercion, initiatory coercion against other people who have not, tried to do something bad to them. And we know that this is the kind of thing that happens. People are seeking employment. They're seeking places to rent or perhaps a place to buy, and they may not be wealthy enough to buy something when they're first coming to the country. It's just a matter of individual self-determination. I'm going to use that term, even though I hate the way that's generally used, because people always mean groups, except for libertarians, we mean individuals. So I'm for, and the only self I know of is the real person's self. You have a self. Not you have. You are a self. I am a self. He and she are selves.
Right.
So that's what I mean by self-determination. You get to as far as possible in the world we live in. Try to determine your own course in life and your own fate, and improve your life and improve the life of your family, your spouse and kids. And there shouldn't be political barriers to it. There shouldn't be private aggressive barriers to it either. I mean, there shouldn't be people standing on the border saying, well, try and get in. We're going to stop you. So that's my elevator pitch.
Yeah,
I hope it's a tall building because I'm pretty long-winded. So
I rely on Ayn Rand's theory of individual rights, which is in the I would argue, some would disagree, is in the Lockean tradition, Frederick Bastiat tradition. That's what I would argue. So
Mhm.
I would say that people do
Mhm.
have a right. One, people have a right to movement, and two, nobody has the right to initiate force. So there's no moral mechanism by which to stop people from crossing the border.
Yeah.
And I just don't. Also, just to add a little something, is Harry Binswanger, the objectivist philosopher, pointed something out to me that I hadn't previously thought of. That it's not only violating the rights of the people trying to cross the border, but you're also ultimately indirectly violating the rights of businesses that would like to hire them, businesses that would like to serve them, maybe renters that would like to rent to them. I've seen people make this argument that only people that are invited should be able to come over. But restaurants don't invite people in that way. It's an open invitation. You just go. Most businesses, whether it be restaurants, amusement parks, bars, well, whatever, bowling alleys, they don't put an invitation for each specific person. It's just an open invitation. And you're stopping somebody based on a border that's been set by government saying you can't come over. So what do you think about that? I mean,
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and the scholar, I think I brought him to your attention. The scholar who is wrote a whole book about that and is talking about that is Chandran Kukathis. It's a name. He's Malaysian, but I knew him years ago. When I worked at the Institute for Humane Studies, he was a postdoctoral fellow there during my second year. So I spent a whole year talking to him. He had, just gotten his PhD at Oxford. He teaches at the what do they call it? The Management University in Singapore now. He used to hold Hayek's chair at LSE. He's a very prominent person. Now he's got a book called, I believe it's Freedom and Immigration, something like that. And while Brian Kaplan likes to stress, I mean, it's not exclusive, but what he likes to stress as the ways that immigrants can get out of the prisons they're in, the metaphorical prison of poverty, and sometimes literal prison, living under a tyranny. While he stresses the benefits to the immigrant, Chandran has been concentrating on this very point you just made, and you attributed to Harry Binswanger, namely that you cannot define and restrict immigrants without defining and restricting citizens. You can't control outsiders without controlling insiders. It's impossible. It's not just a coincidence. It's two sides of the very same coin. I mean, think anybody who thinks about it for 5 seconds, or okay, I give them
one
minutes.
would think, one would
I'll give them
think.
minutes. Would see that, and he attacks this whole idea of society being something in which you are a member or which you belong. He thinks we should live together as human beings, not as members. And the mistake I think so many people make, and there are unfortunately lots of libertarians in this category I'm about to describe, they can't tell the difference between a country and a country club. A country club, first of all, is private property. It's either owned by an owner who has basically customer, or it could be where all the members own it, right? A co-op where they kind of all own it. And there's a membership committee and the criteria, and they interview people to see whether you should get in. That's one form of private property. That's a country club. That's not a country, just because the words are the same. The United States is not a country club.
Yeah.
And so we should not treat immigration as if it were.
Now, there's all sorts of arguments against immigration, and one of the most aggravating words I hear used when referring to immigrants is invasion.
Yeah.
Because the word invasion is used in the Constitution, and even James Madison, they're talking about a military invasion by another government sending their military over here. But it's such an emotionally charged word that people use it in an attempt to basically, it's demagoguery. They want to get people all aggravated and angry against immigrants. And I even see these ridiculous claims about how the Chinese government is deliberately funding this invasion, that they're coming in, and it's military age males is the term you frequently hear.
Yeah.
You've been in the liberty movement for a long time. How long has that specific word or that tenor of argument been taking place, that it's
I
actually an
think that's a
invasion of the
relatively
country?
recent thing. I mean, I can't recall, I could be wrong about this, where even the people that were worried about immigration across the southern border called it an invasion. Uh, they talked more in terms of they're lowering the wages of American workers. Maybe they did, as sort of metaphorical. Today, unfortunately, it's not being used as a metaphor. It's, Trump and people like that want you to think of it quite literally as an invasion. It's a very strange invasion. I mean, there's people coming over, not carrying guns, but wanting to do services for you in return for money. It's a very odd kind of invasion. I'm going to call that invasion. Language is only part of the time used for description. Very often it's used strategically
Yeah.
to push a particular program or agenda. I mean, this is an old insight. I'm not claiming anything original here. I mean, language is not just painting a picture. I'm more with the later Wittgenstein than the earlier Wittgenstein, who just thought you were painting pictures, verbal pictures. He understood that no, there's all kinds of uses for language, and one is to perhaps subtly push a point of view by smuggling it into so you call it an invasion rather than, oh, these are potential workers and renters coming over and customers that might buy in my shop. Bring them in. I don't know if McDonald's considers them invaders. McDonald's and Wendy's rather than customers. So one man's customer is another man's invader, I guess. But I think you need to cut through that.
There's also the matter of the United States Constitution. Years ago, maybe 2008, maybe even earlier, I read an article in the Christian Science Monitor by Donald Boudreaux, and he pointed out something that had never occurred to me, and that the Constitution gives the federal government no authority at all over immigration. And I looked at, and sure enough, it's true. And I've read the Constitutional Convention debates, the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, and there's just nothing there. Now, there is in the Constitution the power to repel invasion, which I suspect is why the term is employed. But James Madison is in his report of 1800 specifically said that that's not what it's referring to. It's not referring to immigrants. But yet people they continue to use that language. To me, though, one of the most disappointing things that I never knew about until recently, I came across it within the last, I don't know, year and a half, is the libertarian opposition to immigration. And it specifically usually comes from anarcho-capitalists, which I find absolutely mind-boggling. But I'm sure you're more familiar with the argument than I am. What is their? I mean, let's steelman their argument. What is their best pitch for why we should have
Well, and
federal?
I think they attribute it to Hans Hermann Hoppe, and I think that's where I believe that's the first libertarian to be talking about it in modern times. I mean, I'm not sure about that, but that seems pretty certain. And the argument is, and it's been picked up by as you know, people you already know of and are aware of. They argue that in the current world, first of all, they start off by saying, look, immigration is a problem only because it's not just a problem, it's even a thing because the state exists. And but what they mean by that, the government, if the country were all private property, anybody would be free to say, I don't want anybody on my property. I only want this type of person on my property. Everybody can come on my property, and all the kinds of positions along that spectrum. So they say, no one would talk about, oh, what's your immigration policy on your farm? They would say, what are you talking about? What do you mean by immigration policy? So, okay, and I think that's a valid point as a matter of just, talking about public policy and what happened, what states give rise to. Where I think they actually go wrong is, they say, okay, we're not in a free market libertarian anarchism. So there is a whole lot of property which the state is not allowing there to be, allowing it to be private. And there's this thinker by the name of Genzel, who's very good. Frederick, I can't remember his first name now, who points out. No, he's not in their camp. He's a free immigration guy, but he points out that when we talk about public property, in other words, property held by the government, which is kind of more or less open to the public. Some property held by government we might call public, but you can't go there. It's not meant for the public. I'm not saying that any of this is legitimate. I'm just trying to now explain the different types. So we're talking about roads, parks, the stuff that is open to the public, but is not. It's not allowed to be privately owned. So as Genzel points out, some of that land has been seized. In other words, there's been eminent domain, which unfortunately is in the Constitution. By the way, it was one of the implied powers of the Constitution. I think we should face up to that. And the reason I know it's an implied power is people always talk about the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment, right? But what's the Fifth Amendment say in that section? It says private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation.
Yeah.
Imagine the amendments had never been passed. They were amendments after all, remember?
Yeah.
Doesn't that tell you that the power of eminent domain is already implied? It's just that they, in thinking up some problems with the original Constitution and adding amendments, they said, oh, and by the way, when you take it, you got to pay. The taking was already implied. They just wanted to make clear, they wanted to put some limit on it. It had to be. So I just want to, that's not a little bit off the point, but Madison argued for implied powers. He's usually considered the person who was against implied powers. They're few and defined. He's the one who says there have to be powers by implication, or else you'd have an infinite list. Anyway, that's another subject. So we have public property, government controlled property that is generally open to the public for various reasons, or at least some segments, like public schools, not open to everybody. It's open to kids. So they say, well, until it's privately owned, until it's privately owned, the government ought to be act in place of the owner. Now, here's where it gets murky. I mean, the owners may disagree, right? First of all, who's the owners? In the case of claimed property, it never had an owner, right? It wasn't allowed to be homesteaded. The government just claimed it way back when, and so a lot of the West was never open to homesteading and then eminent domain. It was just simply not ever allowed to be homesteaded. So what's it mean to say the government ought to be able to pretend that it's the owner and therefore keep immigrants out, or maybe even have lesser restrictions? But in other words, it can legislate this. It's not committed to. It doesn't have to be committed to open borders. And in the case of eminent domain, do you have to go around and find the original owner, the guy that actually lost it? Maybe he's even dead, and say, we're the government. We're not giving you the property back, but what would you like us to do with that? That seems pretty ridiculous too. So I don't see how that case gets off the ground. I wrote an article called "Immigration in an Nth Best World," meaning, okay, what if we're living in an unlibertarian world? We're not fully. I mean, there are aspects that are libertarian. I mean, we have a substantial amount of freedom. Let's be honest about it. So, but it's not the ideal in a world, a less than ideal world. And I tried to lay out that there's no grounds for shutting down immigration or even restricting it, except in a couple of ways you kind of named, or you get some dangerous felon, or somebody who's known worldwide as a terrorist and is fleeing or something like that. Leave aside those tougher issues. The point is that public property, the government. I should add one other thing. The people that are taking this view that I'm criticizing also say, well, surely in this nth best world, that's my term, but that's what they mean. In the nth best world, it's not the case that the government since it is illegitimate, government is illegitimate. And you're right, most of them are anarchists, and I'm an anarcho-capitalist, for lack of a better term. So I agree with them on that point, but not on the point that the case they're building. If there are apparently some people who say, and I guess there are people on Twitter, I don't see them, say something like, since the state is illegitimate, it has no authority or no right to make any kind of rules on public property whatsoever. So the other side can say, the anti-immigration libertarian or the pro-immigration policy libertarian can say, well, that's ridiculous. Do you mean the government can't keep pedophiles from using the girls' bathrooms in schools, in elementary schools? So my answer, and I hope other libertarians will see this as the reasonable answer, that there, in a sense, there's a middle position. In this world, again, the less than perfect world, we don't want to say, it seems unreasonable to say the government can make zero rules. At the same time, it seems like on the other side, it would be unreasonable to say it can make a rule such as no immigrants can come in, or we're going to control numbers. Not trying to keep out the evil people, the kind of you talked about, but we're just going to have quotas or numbers or caps. Both of those are unreasonable. So yes, it can put up a stop sign at an intersection. I guess some people would say, no, the state's illegitimate, no stop signs, and it shouldn't own the streets. Well, right, it shouldn't own the streets, but therefore no stop signs. That's stupid. But on the other hand, no entry at the border. I think there's a difference between a stop sign and a no entry. This means at the southern border, and reasonable rules to keep public property available to the public, for the time being until it's privatized, is perfectly reasonable. I'm against demonstrators blocking roads.
Sure.
I'm generally in favor of, obviously in favor of freedom of speech and redress of grievances and protesting government policies that you don't like. But I don't think that means you can block entry to buildings that other people have a right to enter, or use roads, or stuff like that. So it's a rule of reason and non-obstruction. I call it the non-obstruction principle.
Well, I like that. There's to my way of thinking, ever since I've encountered this argument, there's just so much wrong with it. Like if you just take the instance of a school. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these anti-immigration people want the federal government. That's very vital to me in this conversation. They want the federal government to secure the border. It's even been suggested that federal troops, military, go to the border and prevent people from coming in. So then when you use an analogy and they say, well, what about a school? Do you want a pedophile going into the bathroom? First of all, that's a state issue, not a federal issue. Secondly, the school is specifically designated for education. So therefore, the rules ought to be there to facilitate education. A road is there to facilitate mass movement. So the rules ought to be in line with facilitating mass movement. When it comes to something like immigration, first of all, there's no constitutional authority for it. So they're dead in the water there. The Constitution doesn't prevent school rules in regard to schools. It doesn't prevent rules in regard to roads. So that's the one thing. Secondly, large portions of the border are private property anyway. So what are you going to do? Tell those people they can't let people in? And if they let people in, they've got to keep them prisoner? And what are you going to do with the state-owned parts of the border? Are you going to tell states that they can't be free to let people in if they want to? There's just so many things wrong in my view, starting with that whole argument about let's make public property act as if it's private property, because the libertarians involved, okay, well, if it's in my house, I can tell you you're not going to swear in my house. That's what I could do with my private property. You're not going to wear shoes in my house. You're not going to swear, and you better wear a baseball cap or you're not coming in. So do they want the government then to be able to say, well, you can't you can't carry whatever, a couch on a highway in the back of your truck. You can't do that. And you can't have certain conversations if you're In a park, you can't talk. You better not swear in the park. There's so many things that once you would see
Yeah.
that position where the government can make rules as if it's private property, the society is gone. If you see that
Yeah.
principle, the government basically controls everything. Unless it is actual private property, then the government controls it.
Well, the way Gensel puts it, he says, well, look, an owner is not only interested in who can come on a property, but also interested in how a property is used. Just really echoing your point. So why should our government, the government today, stop at simply, entry, who can come in? If he's in the place of the owner, then he has that whole spectrum of decisions that an owner has a right to make. So not only who comes on, but all the uses for it. So, and you mentioned another problem. What if it says you can't use the interstate highways if you oppose the latest war the United States is in?
Right. Yeah.
Why can't it
If
do that?
Yeah, if you've ever engaged in any anti-government rhetoric, you're not allowed on the interstate highways. And the fact of the matter is, if it were a privately owned road, it's in the interest. I mean, and granted, in a capitalist society, everybody doesn't always act in their own best interest. People make irrational decisions. It's the nature of being amongst humans, right? But generally speaking, a person owns an interstate, say, or portions of an interstate. It's in their interest to allow people to use the interstate so they make money. It's not in their interest to spend an absurd amount of money policing every single person that comes to use the interstate. That's just basic economics. I mean, people are driven largely by incentives. Well, I mean, absolutely by incentives. It's just sometimes people have different incentives or, a misunderstanding of the incentives involved. So if it were that private society, then people would be coming in. And what are you going to tell the road owner? Anybody that comes in and uses your road, if you don't invite him on it and he does something, you're responsible. That's ludicrous.
Yeah.
That just
Yeah.
the logistics involved would be absolutely absurd.
Right. And yeah, that relates to a point, yeah, that I think is also worth raising here. It reminds me of something that we're both fans of Thomas Sass. We talked about him last time. And one of the things he says when he talks about the concepts from psychiatry, like mental illness,
Yeah.
is what do they lead to? In other words, those concepts are used to bring on bad things. I think the same thing happens in this case. If you say there needs to be immigration control and you're going to keep people out or really restrict, who can come in, uh, inevitably people are going to sneak in. It's just what people do,
Right.
especially if they're seeking a better life. They'll do some pretty desperate things and pay a lot of money to very disreputable people, black market. What do they call them? Mules, or the people that bring you in. They wouldn't be
Yeah.
doing that,
Exactly.
in a free market. They'd be getting on a plane for a couple $100, not pay $5,000 to some cutthroat or perhaps rapist or slaver. I don't know.
Yeah.
So people are going to sneak in. What are you going to do then? Well, we know what they do now. They search cars within 100 miles of the border. I mean, as far as 100 miles away from the border, all around the country. They've claimed the authority, the immigration people now. This is federal power to stop cars and search, looking not just even right at the border, 100 miles. The ACLU, I think, estimated that that's a huge percentage of the country. If you go all around, 100 miles in from the coasts, 100 miles in from the borders, that's a big percentage of the country. And yet they have checkpoints. They may be moving east to west, not even south to north, where you figure that's okay. That's where people are headed, right? If they come over from Mexico, they're heading north. No, 99 miles in, they may be going east to west, so cars can get stopped. Is this what we want? Well, this is what you're going to get. And I don't care if it's a libertarian advocating it or an anti-libertarian advocating it. That's what you're going to get, because people will come in. They'll find ways to come in. They're entrepreneurial. Sure. They're ingenious. They're creative, and they're seeking a better life, escaping either grinding poverty or outright tyranny. And they're not going to be stopped. So is that what they want?
It's very important what you were, I think, alluding to, in that you have cartels because of bad government policy already. Because they try to close the border, because immigrants can't just come across, there's an incentive to hire people to get them across. And because drugs are prohibited, there's an incentive for organizations to get into the market to make a lot of money and an incentive to get them over the border. If you got rid of the war on drugs and opened the border, the cartels would in large part go away. Now, they're not going to go away entirely. Criminals don't just become upstanding citizens because you legalize what their means of making a living. But you would seriously kneecap them. You know what I mean? You would really cut off their ability to have such power. But yet, the very things that government has already done to cause it are used to argue for more government power in this situation.
Well, yeah, that's right. Look, we know, and libertarians, of course, know this. Uh, there's kind of like an iron law of black markets. You
Yes.
prohibit something, and I'm not talking about prohibiting murder. You prohibit something that's not inherently aggression against other people, like using a substance or something like that, or moving from one place to another. People will find a way to do it. And the people, since it's against the law, some people will say, well, that's against the law. I'm not going to get involved in that. Even it may not be intrinsically bad, but I don't see myself as a lawbreaker. Most people are going to, that's how most people are going to react. First of all, they also don't want to get in trouble. But,
Mhm.
but even apart from that, they think, well, no, I'm not a lawbreaker. It's not my self-image. So who's that leave it to? The thugs, the people whose comparative advantage is in using physical force. They're tough. People who have a stomach for blood. You know, most of us don't have a stomach for blood. So you're going to get the worst. It's like Hayek's "Why the Worst Get on Top." Although he was talking about a centrally planned society or government, it's going to work there too.
But I think the principle,
You're not going to get the nicest people.
no.
First off, they have disputes. They can't go into court and sue each other because they're doing illegal things. So they're not going to go before a judge and say he went on my turf. I'm doing something illegal, and he undercut my price. That's not fair. I'm suing him. You'd have to violate the Fifth Amendment and self-incriminate. Very few people want to do that. So you're going to get the worst involved, and it's very dangerous then to the desperate people who turn to them anyway. If they knew they could get a work visa, and it was just a matter of course, the default was you get it unless we know you're a vicious criminal or terrorist. They would just go to the consulate where they live, sign up and get it, get together their $400, whatever it is, to fly by Delta to walk to somewhere in the United States, and that would be it. The fact it wouldn't be like a billion people pouring over the border the day we opened, the day we opened the gates. It's just not going to happen that way. And as I wrote in another article, it was attacking the static thinking that's involved here by the anti-immigration libertarians. They think only one thing would change. The gates would come down, and therefore people would pour over, but nothing else would change in society. So in other words, entrepreneurs wouldn't set up exchanges, kind of stations where they matched people to job opportunities and to renting, to housing opportunities, and maybe even transported them to where the jobs are, where there were a bunch of jobs and a bunch of places they think they could rent. Don't they think once it was legal, Americans would respond? And I don't mean out of the goodness of their hearts, so there may be a lot of that too. I don't want to rule out the charitable sector. I'm thinking more of the for-profit people.
Sure.
They would say, hey, there are profit opportunities here. But the other side pretends as if, no, that's not true. People would just do everything. That's really bad social science, right?
Yes.
You make one change and you think there's no responses. It's like, but libertarians don't do that like when it comes to tax rates. If you ask them, well, what's going to happen if you raise the top tax rate to 90%? They'll say people will move or put their income abroad, move their capital abroad or hide income. In other words, all kinds of adjustments because of the legal change. Well, how come no adjustments here by people because of the legal change? Suddenly that idea is like not flees their head. Doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. All right, Sheldon, before I let you go, because I think we've made a good point, do you have anything that you think we should add that I've missed? or that we've missed in relation to this discussion?
Well, let's see. Oh, yeah, there was one thing I did want to say, and
Okay.
I didn't think to tell you about this in advance, but I think we should point out the consequences, the possible potential. I'm not saying these are, I'm not predicting, but in 1924, the United States enacted an immigration law. Should have been called an anti-immigration law, and it put very low caps on people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And when I say low caps, I don't mean they just took the current inflow of people and said, okay, we're capping it here. No, they went back to the 19th century, late 19th century, and put the caps, based on that. So this is 24. So they're going back now over 20 years and said, okay, we want it lower than this. Calvin Coolidge, who some libertarians think was, one of our better presidents, or maybe, one of our least bad presidents, signed the bill and said, we need to make sure, we need to keep America American. He said that. We need to keep America American. Now, what happened in the 30s and 40s with respect to people who were living in Eastern Europe? Now, I pointed out that this law was also Southern Europe, so it also sounds like it's aimed at Greeks, Italians, and Albanians, a lot of people in Southern Europe too. But let's concentrate on Eastern Europe.
Yeah, well, obviously the rise of the Nazis.
They were murdered one way or another, not only by gas chambers, by just old-fashioned bullets. A lot of people in the eastern part of it didn't go through the industrialized murder. They went through the old-fashioned way, although with then modern guns. Between, a whole lot of Jews from Eastern Europe came to the United States between the late 19th century, 1880s, let's say, and 1924. Something like 2.3 million people came. By contrast, only 60,000 went to Palestine, but leave that aside. They wanted to come to America. Now, if we hadn't enacted that law, and instead the good liberals, and I mean this in the libertarian sense, were promoting, who defeated that law, spoke out against the law, mounted all the civil libertarians, and got them to defeat that law, the 20th century might have looked different. I'm not making any predictions. Maybe lots of people, not everybody wants to immigrate anyway, right? A lot of people, there's a status quo bias, or there's a temptation to minimize a real danger, saying, no, it really won't be so bad. It really won't get to here where we are. So I'm not saying everybody would have come over, but who knows how many people would have come to the United States and never would have met a Nazi. I think it might have been a different century.
I think it's a very good point.
That was a horrible law. And Britain did something earlier in 1904 or so, although it did allow for refugees, but it did tighten up immigration, but there was still a refugee provision. So I don't want to make it sound like they shut the gates. They didn't. And Jews were getting in under the refugee provisions, according to what I read.
Okay. All right, Sheldon. So where can people find you now that they've seen you? They know you're
Libertarian Institute.org, ORG is where, just about everything I write is there. Certainly all the political, economic stuff, foreign policy. I do have a free association, which is my blog that's 19 years old, be 20 years old next year. And that's Sheldon Free Association, all run together, .blogspot.com. And you can find me on Substack too. Search for my name, sheldonrichman.substack.com. So I get around.
And for a very long time too, you've been involved in this movement.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember when plays were in black and white.
Okay.
It's a line I've been dying to use. It's original.
Well, thank
you. And I'm on
Twitter.
I'm on X a little bit, as you know, but yes. I'm not a heavy X user.
No, you're not like me. You pop in and out.
I prefer British TV to X.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sheldon.
My pleasure.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.